What if I told you that my mother-in-law's final breath wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of the most shocking family betrayal you've ever heard? When Grace handed me that mysterious envelope in the hospital, I had no idea it would expose decades of lies, lead to a courtroom battle that would destroy my marriage, and reveal a secret that would change everything I thought I knew about family. But here's the twist nobody saw coming, including me. The machines had been beeping for 3 days straight, filling room 314 with their mechanical rhythm. I'd grown so used to that sound that when it suddenly stopped at exactly 3:42 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, the silence hit me like a physical blow. I sat there in that uncomfortable plastic chair, staring at the flat line on the monitor, watching the only person who ever truly saw me slip away forever. Grace, my mother-in-law, was gone, and after 72 hours of keeping vigil, I was the only one there to witness her final breath. The irony wasn't lost on me. For the past 3 weeks, I'd been the only visitor Grace had received. While her own children lived their busy lives, I'd been here every single day, holding her hand, reading to her, and talking to her even when the doctor said she probably couldn't hear me anymore. Down the hall, I could hear other families laughing, crying, celebrating new babies, or saying goodbye to loved ones surrounded by dozens of relatives. The sounds of normal families, doing normal family things. But in room 314, it was just me and the overwhelming silence of abandonment. Where was Mark, her own son? At the office, naturally. He'd visited exactly twice in 3 weeks, both times complaining about hospital parking and how depressing the place was. Where was Megan? Her daughter she'd driven down from the city, once stayed for 20 minutes and spent most of that time on her phone. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Mark just that morning when I called to tell him Grace was declining rapidly. "Can't you handle it, Claire? I've got back-to-back meetings today, and honestly, what's the point of me rushing over there? It's not like she knows I'm there anyway." That's when I knew Grace was going to die alone, except for me. But here's the thing that still gives me chills when I think about it. Just as the nurse came in to turn off the machines and begin the process of preparing Grace's body, she handed me something that would change everything. "She asked me to give this to you specifically," the nurse said softly. She was very clear about that. It was a sealed envelope with my name written in Grace's shaky handwriting. The envelope was thick, like there was more than just a letter inside. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was an old rusty key that looked like it belonged to a house, and a piece of paper with an address I'd never seen before, written in Grace's careful script. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that made my blood run cold and changed everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd just watched die. "They never cared. Now they'll understand what it means to be forgotten." I stared at those words, reading them over and over again, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. Grace had always been the sweet, quiet mother-in-law who never complained, never asked for much, never caused any trouble. The woman who apologized for existing, who accepted whatever scraps of attention her children threw her way with grateful smiles. But this message, this felt like it came from a completely different person. Someone who had been watching, waiting, and planning. Someone who had been keeping secrets. What did she mean by "they never cared"? What was this key for? What was at that address, and why did she give these things to me instead of her own children? As I sat there in that hospital room holding Grace's final gift, I had no idea that in the next few hours, everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and my entire life was about to explode into a million pieces. I drove home from the hospital in a complete daze, that rusty key burning a hole in my pocket, and Grace's final words echoing in my head like a mantra I couldn't escape. The 40-minute drive felt like hours, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. When I finally pulled into our driveway, I could see the blue glow of the television through our living room window. Mark was home, probably exactly where I'd left him 3 days ago when I rushed to the hospital after Grace's doctor called to say she was declining rapidly. I walked through our front door to find him lounging on the couch in his work clothes, scrolling through his phone with a beer balanced on his stomach. The TV was blaring some sports commentary, and there were takeout containers scattered across the coffee table. He didn't even look up when I entered. "Hey, babe," he said casually, not taking his eyes off his phone. "Did you grab groceries on your way back from wherever you were?" "We're out of basically everything." Wherever I was, I stood there in our entryway, still wearing the same clothes I'd put on 3 days ago, exhausted from sleeping in hospital chairs and watching his mother die alone, and he couldn't even remember where I'd been. "Mark," I said, quietly, setting my purse down on the side table. "Your mom passed away this afternoon." He finally looked up from his phone, but his expression wasn't grief or shock or even surprise. It was just nothing. Blank. Like I'd told him we were out of milk or that it might rain tomorrow. "Oh," he said, sitting up slightly and muting the TV. "Okay, well, I guess we'll need to plan a funeral or whatever." Do you know if she had any money saved up for that kind of thing? I stared at my husband of 8 years, this man who was already calculating funeral costs before his mother's body was even cold, and something inside me just snapped. Not in an angry, explosive way, but more like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place with an almost audible sound. "That's it?" I asked. "That's your reaction to your mother dying?" Mark shrugged and reached for the TV remote. "Claire, it's not like this is a surprise. She's been sick for months, and honestly, it's probably better this way. She was suffering, and now she's not. Circle of life and all that." "She asked for you," I said, my voice getting quieter instead of louder. "In her final weeks, she kept asking why you never visited, why you never called." "Come on, Claire, you know I hate hospitals. They're depressing and they smell weird. Besides, what was I supposed to do there? Sit around and watch her sleep?" He turned the TV volume back up. "So, seriously? About those groceries?" I really watched him, as he went right back to scrolling through his phone, like we'd just discussed the weather. This was the same man who hadn't visited his mother once in the 3 weeks she'd been in the hospital. The same man who'd rolled his eyes every time I mentioned driving over to see her. The same man who'd actually complained that Grace's medical bills might affect our vacation fund. The same man who just 2 months ago had laughed when Grace called during dinner and told me to let it go to voicemail because she probably just wants to complain about something anyway. I thought about all those long afternoons I'd spent alone with Grace, holding her hand while she asked in her frail voice why her children never called anymore. All those voicemails from her that Mark would delete without listening to, saying she was just being dramatic. All those times she would light up like a Christmas tree when I walked into her hospital room because I was the only family she had left who actually cared whether she lived or died. And now she was gone. And her own son was asking about groceries. I fingered that mysterious key in my pocket, feeling its rough, worn edges against my skin. Grace had trusted me with something important, something secret, something her own children didn't deserve to know about. The weight of it felt significant, like it was pulling me towards something I didn't understand yet. That night, after Mark fell asleep on the couch watching some late-night talk show, I sat at our kitchen table and pulled out the piece of paper with the address Grace had left me. I'd looked it up online. It was about 40 minutes outside town in a rural part of the county I'd never been to. The satellite view showed what looked like a small house surrounded by trees, completely isolated from everything. Why did Grace own property that none of us knew about? How long had she been keeping this secret, and why me? Why had she chosen to trust me instead of Mark or Megan? I don't know what possessed me, but around midnight I grabbed my car keys and headed for the door. I needed answers, and I had a feeling that whatever Grace wanted me to find at that address, it was going to explain everything. Because if her own family wouldn't honor her memory, if they couldn't even be bothered to grieve her properly, then I would uncover whatever truth she'd been hiding, and I would make sure her final wishes were respected, even if I had no idea what I was walking into. The GPS led me down winding country roads I'd never seen before, past farmland and old oak trees that looked ghostly in my headlights. The further I drove from town, the more isolated everything became. No streetlights, no other cars, just endless darkness broken only by the occasional porch light of a distant farmhouse. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a narrow gravel driveway, marked by a rusty mailbox with no name on it. My car crunched slowly up the drive until I reached a small cottage tucked away behind a wall of overgrown bushes and ancient trees. The house looked like something out of a storybook, but not the happy kind. Weathered blue shutters hung slightly crooked ivy crawled up the sides like reaching fingers, and a front porch sagged just slightly under the weight of years and neglect. In the moonlight, it felt both eerie and strangely peaceful, like a place where secrets came to rest, and time moved differently. My hand shook as I pulled Grace's key from my pocket and approached the front door. The lock was old and stiff, but the key turned easily like it had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. The moment I stepped inside, I knew this place had been frozen in time. Dust particles danced in the beam of my phone's flashlight, and the air smelled like old books and lavender sachets. I found a light switch by the door, and when I flipped it, warm, yellow light filled a room that looked like it had been preserved under glass. Everything was perfectly arranged but untouched for what looked like months, maybe longer. Antique furniture sat exactly where it had been left, with handmade doilies on the side tables, and fresh-looking magazines fanned out perfectly. Family photos lined the mantel, but these weren't photos I recognized from Grace's house. These showed a younger Grace laughing and carefree in ways I'd never seen her. Books were stacked neatly everywhere. Classic novels, poetry collections, gardening guides, and journals with worn leather covers. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the coffee table, next to a teacup that still had a faint ring of dried tea at the bottom. This wasn't just a house. This was Grace's sanctuary, a place where she could be herself without judgment or criticism. I walked through each room, slowly discovering more pieces of the puzzle. The kitchen was small, but perfect, with copper pots hanging from hooks and herbs growing in little pots on the windowsill. The bedroom was cozy and feminine, with a quilt that looked handmade and books stacked on both nightstands. And there on the kitchen counter, next to a vase of dried flowers, was another envelope with my name on it. But this one was different. This one made my heart stop completely. To be opened in the presence of all named family members. What did that mean? What was Grace planning, and how many more surprises had she left for me to discover? Before I could process what that envelope might contain, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the front porch. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I froze, clutching the envelope to my chest, my mind racing. Who else knew about this place? Had someone followed me? Was I trespassing on property that didn't actually belong to Grace? An elderly man appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the night sky. I nearly jumped out of my skin, letting out a small gasp and stepping backward into the kitchen counter. "Easy there," he said gently, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You must be Claire. Grace told me you'd be coming." He was tall and lean, probably in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and dirt under his fingernails like he'd been gardening. He wore old jeans and a flannel shirt, and his whole demeanor radiated the kind of calm, steady presence that immediately put me at ease despite my racing heart. "I'm sorry, who are you?" I asked, still gripping the envelope. "How did you know I'd be here? How do you know my name?" "Name's John Morrison," he said, stepping into the light and removing his baseball cap. "No relation to Grace, just happened to share the same last name. I've been taking care of this place for her for nearly 15 years now. She said when the time came you'd be the one to find it. Said you'd probably come in the middle of the night because you wouldn't be able to wait." My mind was reeling. 15 years. Grace had owned this cottage for 15 years and never mentioned it to anyone in the family. John walked over to the window and adjusted one of the lace curtains like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The gesture was so familiar, so comfortable, that I realized he'd been here recently. This wasn't an abandoned house at all. It was being actively maintained. "She used to come here every Sunday after church," he said, quietly looking around the room with obvious affection. "After her husband died, this became her refuge. Said it was the only place where she could think clearly, where she could be herself, without anyone judging her choices or telling her what to do." But why didn't she ever tell Mark or Megan about this place? I asked, still trying to wrap my head around this secret life Grace had been living. John's expression darkened just slightly, and he sat down heavily in one of the armchairs, gesturing for me to do the same. Oh, she tried. Once. About 10 years ago, she mentioned to Mark that she was thinking about fixing this place up, maybe spending some weekends here, turning it into a little retreat where she could garden and read and have some peace. You know what he told her? I shook my head, but I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going. He told her she was being ridiculous, that she was too old to be playing house in the middle of nowhere. Said it was a waste of money she didn't have, and that if she was lonely, she should just get a cat or join a book club at the senior center. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I didn't like what I was seeing. So she kept it secret. Had to, John said, his voice getting heavier. Mark never let her do much of anything without his approval. Did he always had opinions about how she should spend her time, her money, her life? Megan wasn't much better, always criticizing Grace's choices, always making her feel foolish for wanting things. John looked at the envelope in my hands, and I saw something like satisfaction cross his weathered face. But she was planning something all along, wasn't she? Something they're not going to like very much. I thought about Grace's final message about forgiveness and being forgotten, and suddenly I understood that this cottage wasn't just Grace's secret refuge. It was her headquarters. The place where she'd been plotting something that was going to change everything. John helped me find the contact information I needed, pulling out a well-worn address book from Grace's kitchen drawer. Turns out, Grace's lawyer was a woman named Ms. Bennett who'd been handling her affairs for over 20 years. When I called her the next morning, she wasn't surprised to hear from me at all. Grace said you'd be calling soon, Ms. Bennett said in a crisp, professional voice that somehow managed to be both businesslike and warm. She left very specific instructions about how to proceed after her passing. We need to schedule the reading of her will. Can you arrange for all family members to be present this Friday at 2 p.m.? All family members. I asked, thinking about that envelope that specifically mentioned the same requirement. Yes, Grace was very specific about that. She said it was essential that everyone be present, no exceptions. She even left instructions on what to do if anyone refused to attend. The tone in Ms. Bennett's voice made it clear that Grace had thought of everything. Getting Mark and Megan to show up was exactly as difficult as I expected. When I called Mark at work to tell him about the mandatory will reading, he was immediately irritated. Can't you just handle it, Claire? I've got 3 client meetings on Friday, and honestly, how much could Mom have possibly left her house is probably worth 30 grand tops, and I doubt she had any significant savings. Mark, you have to be there. The lawyer was very clear about this. He sighed dramatically. Fine, but this better not take long. And if I have to reschedule important meetings for this, it's going to seriously impact my commission this month. Megan was even worse. When I reached her at her apartment in the city, she immediately started whining about the inconvenience. Claire, honey, I'm supposed to have lunch with my friend Jessica on Friday. We've had these plans for weeks, and she's flying in from LA just to see me. Can't we do this some other time? Megan, your mother just died. This is her will reading. Look, I loved Mom, but she's gone now, and I'm still here trying to live my life. Besides, what could she possibly have left me? Maybe her jewelry, if it's worth anything. That wedding ring might have some sentimental value, I guess. It took me almost an hour of convincing, but something in my voice must have finally gotten through to them that this was serious, because they both reluctantly agreed to come. Friday afternoon couldn't come fast enough. I spent the days leading up to it reading more of Grace's journals and getting to know the cottage better with John's help. Every page revealed more heartbreak, more instances of her children treating her like an inconvenience rather than a person. When the day finally arrived, we all gathered in Ms. Bennett's small law office downtown. It was one of those old-fashioned legal offices with dark wood paneling and books lining every wall. The tension in that room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark slouched in his chair, checking his phone every 30 seconds and sighing loudly whenever someone looked at him. He'd shown up in a wrinkled polo shirt and jeans like he'd made a point of dressing down for the occasion. Megan kept checking her watch and sighing dramatically occasionally, muttering things like, "This is taking forever," under her breath. She was dressed like she was going to a cocktail party afterward, which she probably was. But there were also two other women there I didn't expect to see. Dorothy and Susan from Grace's church, two sweet elderly ladies in their 70s, who looked genuinely sad about Grace's passing. They sat quietly holding hands and occasionally dabbing at their eyes with tissues. "Why are they here?" Mark asked rudely, gesturing toward the church ladies. "This is supposed to be family only." Ms. Bennet looked at him over her reading glasses with the kind of expression that suggested she'd dealt with difficult family members before. "They're here because Grace specifically requested their presence," she said calmly, "and you'll understand why in a moment." Ms. Bennet was all business. She opened a thick folder and pulled out multiple documents, arranging them carefully on her desk. When she began reading, her voice took on that formal lawyer tone that somehow made everything sound more serious and final. "I, Grace Eleanor Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby distribute my worldly possessions as follows." Mark straightened up in his chair like he'd been shocked with electricity. Megan stopped checking her phone and suddenly gave Ms. Bennet her full attention. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment they'd finally find out what they were going to inherit. "To my son Mark." Ms. Bennet read her voice steady and clear. "I leave my forgiveness, though you've never earned it." The silence in that room was absolutely deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. Mark's face went from expectant to confused to bright red in the span of about 3 seconds. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" he sputtered, half rising from his chair. "Forgiveness? What about her house? What about her savings account? What about her car?" Ms. Bennet continued reading without acknowledging his outburst, her voice never wavering. "To my daughter, Megan, I leave my wedding ring, the only thing you ever showed interest in." Megan's mouth fell open like she'd been slapped. "That's it! A ring! What about everything else? What about her investments? Her bank accounts?" To Dorothy and Susan, my dear friends from St. Mary's Church, Ms. Bennet continued, "I leave $5,000 each with my gratitude for your kindness during my final years when my own children couldn't be bothered to visit." The two church ladies gasped and clutched each other's hands, tears streaming down their faces. They were the only ones in the room who looked genuinely moved by Grace's generosity. And then Miss Bennet looked directly at me and I felt my heart stop completely. "To my daughter-in-law Claire, who showed me more love and respect in my final months than my own children showed me in years, I leave everything else. My house, my cottage, all bank accounts, investments, personal belongings, and any other assets not previously mentioned in this document." The room absolutely exploded. Mark shot to his feet so fast, his chair tipped over backward. "What? This is absolutely insane! She can't do that! This has to be fraud or elder abuse or something." Megan was screaming at the top of her lungs. "This is ridiculous! She manipulated a sick old woman! I'm going to contest this will and drag you through every court in this state." But I just sat there completely stunned into silence while Dorothy and Susan were crying happy tears and hugging each other, and Miss Bennet calmly shuffled through more papers like people weren't losing their minds all around her. "I assure you," Miss Bennet said, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the chaos, "this will is completely legal and was executed while Grace was of perfectly sound mind. In fact, she anticipated exactly this reaction and left additional documentation to support her decisions." She pulled out what looked like medical records and placed them on the desk. Psychiatric evaluation, cognitive assessment, multiple witness statements. Your mother was sharper than you gave her credit for. And that's when I realized Grace hadn't just been planning this. She'd been preparing for war, and somehow I'd been chosen as her general. As Mark was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "This is absolutely ridiculous. Mom was clearly not thinking straight. She was on medication. She was grieving. She wasn't competent to make these kinds of decisions." Megan pointed an accusatory finger right at me. You manipulated her. You isolated her from her real family and brainwashed her into giving you everything. I was still processing what had just happened. Grace had left me everything I thought back to all those quiet afternoons in her hospital room, all those times she'd squeeze my hand and whisper, "Thank you for seeing me." But then, I remembered something else. That appointment in March that I'd driven her to. She'd been vague about what it was, just said it was important business she needed to handle. Now it all made sense. "You want to contest this will?" Ms. Bennett asked calmly, apparently unfazed by their outburst. "Please be my guest, but you should know that Grace prepared extensively for this possibility." She pulled out a thick manila folder. "Psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Williams conducted just 2 months ago. Clean bill of mental health. Cognitive assessment from Dr. Rodriguez. Again, perfectly competent." Mark's face was getting redder by the second. "Those could be fake. She could have paid them off. And there's more." Ms. Bennett continued ignoring him completely. She pulled out a small video camera and set it on the desk. "Grace recorded a video statement explaining her decisions. Would you like to see it?" The room went dead silent. Even Megan stopped her ranting. Ms. Bennett pressed play, and suddenly there was Grace on the tiny screen sitting in what I now recognized as the cottage. She looked tired but determined, and her voice was steady and clear. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and my children are throwing a tantrum about my will. Mark, Megan, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say." Mark slumped back in his chair like he'd been slapped. Grace continued looking directly into the camera. "For the last 10 years of my life, you treated me like a burden. You rolled your eyes when I called. You made excuses to avoid visiting. You complained about every penny I spent and every decision I made." Megan's eyes were filling with tears, but not the sad kind. The angry kind. "But Claire saw me when my own children didn't. She held my hand when I was scared. She listened to my stories when you couldn't be bothered. She drove me to appointments when you were too busy. She treated me like a human being instead of an inconvenience." The video, Grace paused, and I could see her gathering her strength. "So, yes, I'm leaving her everything. Because she earned it. Because she deserves it. And because you two need to learn what it feels like to be forgotten." The video ended, and the silence in that room was absolutely crushing. That's when Megan lost it completely. "This is war, Claire. I'm going to contest this will, and I'm going to drag you through every court in this state until I get what's rightfully mine." But all I could think about was Grace's voice saying I saw her when her own children didn't. And suddenly, I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. After that explosive meeting, I couldn't face going home to Mark. So I drove straight to the cottage, letting myself in with Grace's key like I belonged there. Maybe I did belong there. Maybe this was where Grace always intended for me to end up. I spent that first night just wandering through the rooms, trying to understand who Grace really was when nobody else was watching. And that's when I found them. Hidden in the bottom drawer of an old oak desk were dozens of journals, some dating back 15 years. My hands trembled as I opened the first one. Grace's handwriting filled every page neat and careful, documenting a life of quiet heartbreak that I never could have imagined. The entries painted a picture that made my stomach turn. Mark hadn't just been neglectful. He'd been bleeding her dry for years. March 15th, 2018. Mark called today asking for money again. Says his business is struggling and he needs $5,000 to make payroll. I transferred the money from my savings. He promised to pay me back by Christmas. It's been 3 Christmases now. July 4th, 2019. Mark borrowed my car for the weekend and returned it with a huge dent in the side. When I asked what happened, he said I should be grateful he didn't total it. He never offered to pay for repairs. But it wasn't just Mark. Megan's treatment of Grace was even more cruel in some ways. October 12th, 2020. Megan came by today and spent the entire visit making fun of my clothes. She said I dress like an old lady and that it's embarrassing to be seen with me. She left without saying goodbye. December 23rd, 2021. Called Megan to invite her for Christmas dinner. She said she'd rather eat at McDonald's than come to my house. When I asked why, she said my cooking is terrible and my house smells like old people. The holiday entries were the worst. Page after page of Grace cooking elaborate meals for family gatherings where nobody showed up. Thanksgiving 2022 made the full spread. Turkey stuffing cranberry sauce, 3 different pies. Waited until 8 p.m. for someone to call or visit. Ate dinner alone while watching the news. Gave the leftovers to John. Christmas Eve 2022. Set the table for 4 just in case. Made my famous sugar cookies that the kids used to love. No one came. John stopped by around 9 p.m. and found me crying over the cookie dough. He helped me eat them all. John, that sweet man who'd been taking care of the cottage. I could see now that he'd been taking care of Grace's heart too. The next morning, I found him tending to the garden behind the cottage. When he saw me reading one of the journals, his expression grew sad, but not surprised. She wrote in those things every single day, he said, pulling weeds from around a rose bush. Started keeping them after her husband died. Said it helped her make sense of things. John, did you know how badly they treated her? He stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. Oh, honey, I saw it all. Every broken promise, every canceled visit, every time they made her feel small. But Grace, she had the biggest heart. Always making excuses for them, always hoping they'd change. So what made her finally stop hoping? John looked toward the cottage, and I saw something hard flash in his kind eyes. It was about 6 months ago. Mark came here demanding she sell this place so he could have the money for some investment scheme. When she said no, he told her she was being selfish and stupid. Said she was too old to make her own decisions anymore. My heart sank. That sounded exactly like something Mark would say. And that's when something in Grace just broke. She stopped making excuses, stopped hoping they'd change, started planning instead. John smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd finally seen justice served. Grace wasn't bitter even at the end, but she was done being anyone's fool. True to her word, Megan filed a formal contest of Grace's will within 2 weeks. The legal papers were delivered to the cottage on a rainy Tuesday morning, and I have to admit, my hands shook as I read through all the accusations. Manipulation, undue influence, mental instability, elder abuse. They were throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. But Miss Bennett wasn't worried. In fact, when I called her in a panic, she actually chuckled. Claire Grace spent 2 years preparing for this exact scenario. Trust me when I say we're ready. 3 months later, we found ourselves in a stuffy courthouse downtown. Megan had hired some hotshot lawyer from the city, who wore a $1,000 suit and talked like he was arguing a murder case. Mark sat behind them looking smug and confident. I felt sick to my stomach. What if they actually won? What if a judge decided that Grace really had been manipulated? But then I looked at Ms. Bennett, sitting calmly at our table with 3 thick binders full of evidence, and I started to feel better. Megan's lawyer went first, painting me as some kind of master manipulator who'd isolated Grace from her loving family and brainwashed her into changing her will. He made it sound like I was running some elaborate con game. Your Honor, he said dramatically, this woman systematically alienated my client's mother from her biological children and manipulated her during her most vulnerable moments. When it was Ms. Bennett's turn, she stood up slowly and opened the first binder. Your Honor, I have here comprehensive psychiatric evaluations conducted by 2 independent doctors, both of whom found Grace Morrison to be of completely sound mind when she executed her will. She placed the documents on the judge's desk, like she was playing winning cards in poker. I also have audio recordings that Grace made specifically to document her children's treatment of her should this day ever come. My heart pounded as Ms. Bennett played the first recording. Grace's voice filled the courtroom clear and steady. This is Grace Morrison, and I'm recording this on March 15th, 2023. Megan called today to ask if she could have my diamond earrings, the ones I wore on my wedding day. When I asked why, she said she wanted to sell them because she needed money for a vacation to Europe. When I told her I wasn't ready to give them away, she called me selfish and said I was going to die soon anyway, so what did it matter? The silence in that courtroom was deafening. I could see Megan's face turning bright red behind me. But Miss Bennett wasn't done. She played recording after recording, Grace documenting every cruel comment, every broken promise, every time her children made her feel worthless. And then came the final recording made just weeks before Grace died. I want everyone to understand something. I am not leaving my estate to Claire because she manipulated me. I am leaving it to her because she loved me when my own children couldn't be bothered to. She saw me as a person worth caring about, and that's something neither Mark nor Megan ever did. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was firm and clear. Based on the evidence presented, I find no grounds to contest this will. Mrs. Morrison was clearly of sound mind and had valid reasons for her decisions. The will stands as written. And then came the kicker. Furthermore, given the frivolous nature of this contest and the extensive evidence of the deceased's mental competency, I'm ordering the plaintiffs to pay all court costs and legal fees. Megan's face went white. Her expensive lawyer started shuffling papers nervously. But me, I just sat there thinking about Grace's voice on those recordings, finally telling her truth after years of being silenced. Justice felt pretty sweet that day. After the court decision, something interesting happened. Suddenly, Mark remembered how to be a husband. I came home from the cottage one evening to find roses on the kitchen counter. Real roses, not the cheap grocery store kind. The house smelled like garlic and herbs, and Mark was actually cooking dinner from scratch. "Hey, beautiful," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "I thought we could have a romantic evening, just the two of us." I stood there stiff as a board, watching him play this part he'd never bothered to play before. The loving husband, the attentive partner, the man who suddenly cared about my feelings. I was thinking, he continued, stirring something on the stove. Maybe we could take that trip to Napa we always talked about. You know, reconnect. Start fresh. Start fresh. Like 8 years of neglect could be erased with some flowers and a weekend getaway. "That's nice, Mark," I said, pulling away from him. "But I'm pretty tired. I think I'll just go to bed." He tried this routine for weeks. Surprise dinners, little gifts, romantic gestures that felt as genuine as a $3 bill. But I could see right through it now. This wasn't love, this was desperation. He'd lost his meal ticket when Grace died, and now he was scrambling to hold on to the next best thing. Me, and whatever I'd inherited. But if Mark's approach was pathetic, Megan's was downright heartbreaking. The first call came at 2 a.m. on a Thursday night. I was sleeping peacefully at the cottage when my phone rang. Megan's name flashed on the screen. "Claire," her voice was thick with tears. "Claire, please don't hang up." I almost did, but something in her tone made me hesitate. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about everything. About the lawsuit, about the things I said, about how I treated Grace." She was sobbing now. "But Claire, I have nothing. The court fees wiped out my savings. I can't afford my rent. I might lose my apartment." Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her. The part of me that remembered holiday dinners when we all still pretended to be a family. "Please," she whispered. "You have so much now. Could you just help me get back on my feet? Alone, maybe I'll pay you back, I promise." I thought about Grace's journals. All those entries about Mark promising to pay her back. All those broken promises and empty words. "I can't help you, Megan," I said quietly. "What do you mean you can't? You inherited millions. Grace's house alone is worth a fortune." And there it was. The real Megan, shining through the tears and apologies. "Good night, Megan." I hung up and blocked her number. But even after I silenced my phone, I couldn't get back to sleep. I kept thinking about that envelope Grace had left me at the hospital. The one with that chilling message I still hadn't fully understood. I got up and found it where I'd kept it safe in Grace's desk drawer. The paper was worn now from all the times I'd read it, but the words were still clear. "They never cared, Now they'll understand what it means to be forgotten. And underneath, in Grace's shaky handwriting, were the words that had been haunting me for months. Forgive no one. Let them beg. Let them kneel. I used to think those words sounded cruel. But sitting there in Grace's cottage, surrounded by her journals, documenting years of heartbreak, I finally understood. This wasn't about cruelty. This was about justice. Grace had spent decades forgiving people who never deserved it. She'd spent her final years hoping for love from children who were incapable of giving it. And now, finally, they were learning what it felt like to be powerless, to need something from someone who didn't owe them anything. Grace's final gift to me wasn't just money or property. It was the freedom to say no. 6 months after the court battle, I made a decision that would have made Grace smile. I was going to turn her secret cottage into something beautiful, something that would honor her memory in a way her own children never could. I started by renovating the cottage itself. John helped me strip the old wallpaper and refinish the hardwood floors. We painted the walls a warm, welcoming yellow and filled the rooms with comfortable furniture and soft lighting. But this wasn't going to be just a house. This was going to be Grace's cottage, a non-profit community center for people who understood what it meant to feel invisible. The main room became a space for grief support circles. I'd learned from Grace's journals that there were so many people in our community dealing with loss and loneliness, just like she had been. The smaller rooms were perfect for different activities. One became a writing room where people could journal their feelings, just like Grace had done for years. Another became a craft room where neighbors could come together and create something beautiful with their hands. And the kitchen, that became the heart of everything. Just like Grace had always dreamed, it was filled with the sounds of people cooking and laughing together. Dorothy and Susan from Grace's church were my first volunteers. They helped me organize weekly community dinners where anyone could come for a home-cooked meal and genuine conversation. No one ate alone at Grace's cottage, but the most special room was Grace's library. I had all of her journals professionally preserved and displayed in glass cases, creating a reading room where visitors could understand the woman behind the legacy. Her words, her pain, her hope, all preserved for people who might be walking the same lonely path she once walked. 3 months after we opened, the local newspaper ran a feature story about Grace's cottage. The headline read, "Local Woman's Legacy Lives On Through Community Center." For the first time in decades, Grace's name was being spoken with respect and admiration, instead of pity or dismissal. The reporter interviewed several regular visitors. Maria, a widow who'd been grieving her husband for 2 years, said the grief circles had saved her life. Tom, a veteran dealing with PTSD, talked about how the writing group helped him process his trauma. Grace Morrison may be gone, the reporter wrote, but her spirit of kindness and acceptance lives on in every person who finds healing at her cottage. I kept that newspaper clipping in Grace's desk right next to her final letter to me, because this is what Grace had really wanted all along. Not revenge against her children, but proof that her life had mattered, that her capacity for love hadn't been wasted even if her own family couldn't see it. Every Tuesday evening when the cottage was full of people sharing meals and stories, I could almost feel Grace's presence in the warm glow of the kitchen lights. She wasn't forgotten anymore. She was celebrated. And neither was I. A year after Grace's death, Mark made one last desperate play. He called me on a Sunday morning, his voice warm and nostalgic. "Claire, I've been thinking about us a lot lately, about how good we used to be together. Remember that little cafe where we had our first date? Would you meet me there just to talk?" Something in his tone made me curious. After months of failed romantic gestures, what was he planning now? I agreed to meet him, but I came prepared. The cafe looked exactly the same as it had 8 years ago. Mark was already there, sitting at what used to be our favorite table by the window. He'd dressed up wearing the blue shirt I used to say looked good on him. "You look beautiful," he said as I sat down. "I've missed you so much." We made small talk for a few minutes, but I could tell he was building up to something. His hands kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. Finally, he pulled out a small velvet box and placed it on the table between us. Claire, I know I haven't been the husband you deserved. I know I made mistakes, but losing you has made me realize what really matters. He opened the box to reveal a diamond ring. It was actually quite pretty, if you didn't know what I knew. This was my grandmother's ring, he said, his eyes getting misty. I want you to have it. I want us to start over, to renew our vows, to build the life we always dreamed of. I stared at that ring, and all I could think about was Grace's journal entry from 2 years ago. The one where she mentioned that Mark had asked to borrow her mother-in-law's diamond ring to sell for one of his failed business ventures. "It's beautiful, Mark," I said quietly. His face lit up with hope. "But I can't accept it." I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across the table to him. "What's this?" he asked, his smile faltering. "Divorce papers? Already signed?" The color drained from his face as he opened the envelope and saw the official documents. "Claire, you can't be serious. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can—" "Mark," I interrupted gently. "Your mother spent 30 years hoping your father would change. I'm not going to spend another 30 years hoping you will." I stood up, leaving him sitting there with his fake ring and his empty promises. 2 weeks later, I got an email from Megan. The tone was completely different from her desperate, middle-of-the-night phone calls. "Claire, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to reach out because I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. I know I haven't always been the best sister-in-law, and I know I said some terrible things during the legal proceedings. I was wondering if we could possibly meet for coffee sometime. I'd love to apologize properly and maybe discuss the possibility of us having a relationship moving forward. I miss having family, and I think Grace would have wanted us to stay connected. Please let me know if you'd be open to this." It was polite. It was humble. It was perfectly crafted to make me feel guilty for cutting her off. I didn't respond with words. Instead, I took a photo of Grace's final letter, the one with the line that had become my guiding principle. "Forgive no one. Let them beg. Let them kneel. And when they do, smile, turn, and walk away." I sent her the photo with no caption. Then I blocked her email address too. But you know what? I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter or resentful. I was free. Every evening now, I walk through Grace's cottage and see the life she'd helped me build. In the main room, seniors share stories over cups of tea. In the craft room, children paint pictures while their parents attend grief counseling. In the kitchen, volunteers prepare meals for anyone who needs them. This place is alive with laughter, with healing, with the kind of community Grace had always dreamed of being part of. And every night before I lock up, I walk to the old oak tree behind the cottage, the one Grace used to sit under when she needed to think. I place my hand on its rough bark and whisper the same words. "You were never forgotten, Grace. And now, neither am I." Grace's story didn't end with her death. It began with it. And my story, well, that's just getting started. Sometimes, the people who hurt us the most end up giving us the greatest gift, the strength to walk away and build something beautiful on our own. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have forgiven them or chosen your own freedom like I did? If this story moved, you hit that subscribe button for more real-life family drama stories. And remember, you don't need anyone's permission to choose yourself. See you in the next one.